Today we're going to cover combat in Unity, and this will involve some scripting as well as some work in the scene using the NavMesh. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a ground where the characters are going to walk on. So I'll create a plane, and I'm going to make this a bit larger so I have more room to work with. And I'm also going to create a few materials. So I'm going to create a materials folder. This way I can easily see what different things are in the scene and they won't all blend in together. So let's create a new material. This one will be for the ground. And I like to turn the smoothness all the way down for the ground. I don't like to have a shiny ground. And then right here next to albedo, we can select the color that we want to use for our ground color. And then just drag it onto that ground plane. Next, I'm going to make a character object. So I'll go to Game Object, 3D, Capsule, and let's drag this up a bit so it's above the ground. And I'm going to make a material for the player. And again, I'm going to turn the smoothness all the way down, and I'm going to make this blue. And now we need some enemies. I'm going to once again use a capsule. And for the enemies, I'm going to make them start out as yellow. And then when I am attacking an enemy, I will change its color so that I can tell which enemy I'm attacking. So my enemy default color will be yellow. To make it a little easier to see what I'm doing, I'm going to position the camera up above my play space and rotate it down so it's facing towards the characters. Now I'm going to control my character movement using the NavMesh. And so the example I'm going to show is to move the character with the NavMesh, but this can also easily be used to move the enemies using the NavMesh. So for now, I'm going to start with just using the NavMesh for the playable character. So I'm going to open a window under AI called Navigation, and this is where we set up the NavMesh. So we need to select surfaces that can be walked on. So I'm going to select the ground plane and check the box for navigation static. This tells the NavMesh that this plane is never going to move. It's static. And from the navigation area drop down, we can choose between walkable, not walkable, and jump. Today I'm only going to be using walkable and not walkable. For the ground, this is a walkable area that the character can walk on. I'm also going to create some obstacles in the scene so that there's something for the character to walk around. So I'll create a couple of cubes, and I'm going to give them a material as well. And switch back to the inspector to set the color of this material. And so this is maybe like a bush or some type of plant that my character is going to have to walk around. And I'm just going to duplicate this a couple of times so I have a couple of different obstacles. Then back in my navigation window, I'm going to select all of these obstacles that I've made. Once again, check the box for navigation static. These are not going to move. And for these, I'm going to change the drop down to not walkable. So these are things that the player cannot walk on. So then I'm going to go to the Bake tab. We started off on the Object tab. This is where we specify if something is walkable or not walkable. Then on the Bake tab, I'm just going to hit the Bake button, and it's going to create a NavMesh. Now, one thing to make sure that you're aware of is I did not mark my player character as navigation static. I also did not mark the enemy as navigation static. Navigation static means that it is something that is never going to move. And then the NavMesh will be generated based on where it's currently positioned. So these two objects are going to move, so we don't want to mark them as static. So you can see here, everywhere that's blue is areas that the character can now walk on. And this buffer area here is to make sure that the character doesn't clip through that object when it's walking around. Back in the inspector, in order to make the player character use the NavMesh, I need to add a component on the player. called NavMesh agent. And I'm just going to leave all of the default settings for this NavMesh agent. I'm also going to go ahead and change my capsule name to player so I can find it more easily. And similarly, I'm going to change my enemy capsule to enemy. Now it's time to make some scripts. So I'm going to create a new folder called scripts. And in the scripts folder, I'm going to create a new C# script. This one is going to be called player. And I'm going to go ahead and make a second one right now for the enemies. So I'll right click again, create C# script, enemy. And I'm going to select the player in the scene and drag the player script down to the bottom area where it says add component. You can also drag the player script onto the object itself. Make sure that you only end up with one instance of the script. If you get more than one instance of the script attached to the same object, you'll want to just right click on that component and remove component. There should only ever be one copy of the script on an object. Then with my enemy selected, I'm going to do the same thing to drag the enemy script onto that object. Let's go ahead and double click to open these scripts up. And for my player script, the first thing I want to do is have the character move on the NavMesh based on where my mouse is. This is going to use a raycast from the camera, or from the world position of the camera to the screen position based on my mouse. And so this ray is going to cast from where I click into the world to detect if I have hit something. So I'm just going to set up the ray itself, which is going to come from the camera, and the raycast hit is the thing that's actually going to store the information of what was hit from my raycast. And so what I want to do is check if the physics raycast, this returns true if it hits something, and then this out hit means that it's storing whatever it hit in this variable, and it has some information that we can use. Now, in order to use the information of where the raycast hit, we want to access the NavMesh agent that we put on the player character. So this NavMesh agent has the ability to move the character object around on the surface of the NavMesh. So if we go back to our script, at the top, I'm going to add a private NavMesh agent. And you might notice that it's not automatically filling this in for me because I do not have access to the NavMesh agent component unless I add the navigation or the AI up to the top of my script. So I'm going to add using Unity engine.ai. And now as soon as I type that in, you can see it turns my NavMesh agent green. That means I now have access to this variable type. So I'm going to make a NavMesh agent called my agent. That's just the name of my variable. And in the start function, I'm going to set my agent equal to get component NavMesh agent. So this finds the NavMesh agent component attached to this game object and stores the value as this variable. So now this variable, my agent, is referring to this component, this NavMesh agent component. So in my if statement where I'm checking if my raycast hit something, this is where I can specify where I want the NavMesh agent to move. So I can set my agent dot destination. This says this is where the agent is trying to walk to. And I set it equal to hit dot point. So hit dot point is the position in the world where my raycast hit something. So this is going to attempt to move the character to wherever the raycast from my mouse went. So I'm going to go ahead and save this script and test it out in my scene. And so now you can see that my character is following my mouse cursor around. Now I'm not clicking or anything. This is just constantly moving towards wherever my mouse is. And this is something where we would want to probably have the character only move when the mouse is being pressed down. It's a little bit difficult to make decisions about where I want the character to go if it's constantly following my cursor. So I want to change this to check if the mouse button is being pressed down. So I'm going to add that into my if statement. Before I check for the raycast, I'm going to add before this input dot get mouse button 0. 0 is the left mouse button. So this will check if the left mouse button is being held down. And then we add these 2 ampersands so that we can check to see if both this condition is true and this condition is true. If both these conditions are true, then it will do this line of code here to update the agent destination. So let's save that and try it out again. So now the character walks to wherever I click in the environment. And you can see that the NavMesh agent and the NavMesh work together really well to create a smooth walking transition to go from one point to another without walking through any of these obstacles. You can see that it pathfinds around the obstacle. Now let's add the ability to target an enemy. So I'm going to add in this if condition. So I want to still check for the mouse button to be pressed and do the raycast. And now I want to also check if the thing that I clicked on, and that would be the hit dot collider. So this lets us find the collider of an object that we raycasted to. And I'm going to check if the tag is enemy. This way I can have a special condition for only when the user has clicked on the enemy. And what I want to do when the user clicks on the enemy, just first to test this out, I'm going to set the color hit.collider.get component mesh renderer dot material dot color. I'm going to set the color of the enemy object to color.red so that I can see when I have clicked on it. So let's go ahead and do that. So now I can walk around. And you know what? I actually did not tag my enemy. So we want to make sure that we actually tag this as enemy. So with my enemy object selected, I'm going to add a tag to this tag dropdown here where it says untagged. I'm going to add a new tag to my list called enemy with a capital E. It's important that it's spelled the same here as you have it spelled in your script. So these two need to match perfectly. When you create a new tag in your tag list, it does not automatically apply it to the object you had selected. So with my enemy selected, once again, I need to use this drop down and select enemy. Now when I click on the enemy, it turns red. Now let's say I have multiple enemies. I probably want to only have one enemy selected at a time. So I'm going to add the ability to deselect the enemy. I'm going to store a variable at the top, a private game object. And I'm going to call this enemy target so that I can target one specific enemy at a time. Then in my if statement where I check if I clicked on an enemy, I'm going to set the enemy target equal to the hit.collider.gameObject. So this is going to say whatever game object I hit with this hit from my raycast, I'm going to store that value as this variable, this enemy target variable. And I'm going to add in another if statement above this current one. So in this if statement, this is where I'm specifying a enemy to target. And what I want to do is if My enemy target is already set. So if it's not equal to null, then I want to actually clear out that enemy. So this would be the old enemy, and I'm about to specify a new enemy. So, and this would also, if I'm clicking somewhere in the world other than on an enemy, I also want to clear this out. So I'm going to set my enemy target dot get component mesh renderer dot material dot color equals color dot yellow. So this will reset my color to yellow for my enemy. And then I'm going to make this enemy target null. So now I've deselected this enemy. So if I have one already selected, so the enemy target is not null, I'm going to reset the color to yellow and set that enemy target to null. That way, if I'm clicking on another enemy or somewhere else in the world, it clears out the previous enemy target. So let's go ahead and save that. And to make it a little bit more interesting to test it out, I'm going to make multiple enemies. Anytime we're creating something where we're going to duplicate and have multiple versions of the same object, and we want that object to have the same behavior and the same various components like its model and things like that, we first want to make it into a prefab. That way, later when we're making changes to this enemy, we can quickly apply the changes to all of the instances. So rather than just duplicating the enemy, I'm going to create a folder called prefabs. And I'm going to drag my enemy into that prefabs folder. I'm also going to go ahead and drag in the player. That way I have a prefab version of the player. This would be really useful, especially if I wanted to have multiple players in the scene or if I wanted to have the player exist in different scenes. So it's just always a good idea to make a prefab of something if you think there's a chance you might reuse it at some point. So now my enemy is a prefab, and I can either drag in more enemies from my prefabs folder, or I can duplicate the enemy prefab. Both of these options will work, and you can see that if it has this blue cube next to it and the blue text, that means that it is a prefab object. So later when I'm making changes, it will apply those changes to all of my enemies. So now let's test out that change we made. So now I can select enemies, and if I change my destination, it will deselect the previous enemy. Now that I have the ability to walk my character around and target enemies, I think it's time to give the enemies the ability to attack the player. So I'm going to go ahead and open my enemy script, and I'm going to have a cooldown timer for a ranged attack. So what I'm going to have is the enemies are firing projectiles at the player. So what I want to do is have a public int cooldown. So this is how much time there will be between the attacks. And then I'm going to have a private float as my attack timer. So my attack timer will be counting down, and when my attack timer reaches 0, then I will fire a projectile. In my start function, I'm going to set my attack timer equal to cooldown. The cooldown is a public variable, so that's something I can set in the scene. That way different enemies can have different cooldown timers. Then in my update function, I want to update my attack timer. So I'll do attack timer minus equals time.delta time. Time.delta time is how much time has passed since the previous frame. So on every instance of update, it's subtracting the amount of time since the last time it ran update, which means this is keeping accurate count of the time that has passed. Once that timer has gotten to less than or equal to 0, then I will spawn my projectile. I haven't actually created my projectile yet, so I'm going to go ahead and hop back into the scene to create the projectile. Let's make a sphere, and I'm going to scale this down so it's pretty small. And let's give this a material also. I'm going to make my projectile purple so I can tell it apart from everything else. And this one I'm going to go ahead and leave it shiny. I think it looks cool having this one shiny. So now I have a sphere as my projectile, and let's name this projectile. And we want to create a prefab of this, but we're not going to place it in the prefabs folder, because what we want to do is we actually want to access this prefab from a script. And to access something from a folder in a script, we need to make that a resources folder. This needs to be spelled exactly correctly with a capital R, resources, plural. This allows us to access things in this folder from within a script. So I'm going to drag my projectile into that folder, and then I'm going to delete it from the scene. Now, if we want to continue editing this projectile, we can double click on it. And now I'm editing the projectile prefab. This is a new feature in the later versions of Unity starting in 2018, where you have a specific editor for the prefabs. Previously, you could apply changes to the prefab in the scene, but now once you have a prefab, in order to apply changes across the prefab, you actually have to edit the prefab in this mode. So in this mode, I'm going to check the box for is trigger on my projectile. I want this to be able to pass through things. I don't want it to get stuck when it collides with things. And then I'm also going to add a rigid body component. This will allow us to detect when it has collided with the player. It also will allow us to add force to have it moving in a continuous direction. And I'm going to uncheck the box for use gravity because I don't want my projectile to fall. And I'm also going to tag this. Eventually, we're going to want to detect when this collides with the player, and it will be helpful to have a tag for it when we get to that point. So I'm going to tag this as damage. Once again, go back to the drop down to select the new tag you created. And now we hit this back arrow to exit out of the prefab edit mode. Now in our C# script, we can add the spawner to instantiate the prefab. So I'm going to do instantiate, and here we access our resources folder, resources.load, and in parentheses and in quotes, we put the name of the prefab that we just created, which was called projectile. Once again, this needs to be spelled correctly and use the same capitalization that you used in when you created your prefab. Now we need to specify a position and rotation to instantiate this object. So I'm going to instantiate this at the position of the enemy that's casting it. So that's transform.position. That gets the position of the game object this script is attached to. Then we also need a rotation, transform.rotation, close parenthesis, and semicolon. Now, one problem with instantiating it this way is we can't actually make changes to this object after we've instantiated it, because in this case, we're going to want to add force to have it moving forward. And once it's instantiated, I lose reference to it. So what we want to do is instantiate this and then store it in a temporary variable. So I'm going to make a game object variable called projectile. I'm going to use a lowercase p for this projectile and set that equal to all of this instantiate. But this instantiate is actually instantiating an object, not a game object. So we want to modify this. So we want to say as game object. So this tells it, hey, this thing that I'm instantiating here, I'm going to make that a game object. And then we can store it as this projectile variable. Now we have a reference to this object that we just created, so we can specify the force we want to add. So we'll do projectile.getComponent rigid body. The rigid body is what allows us to add force. Add force, and I want to add it in the forward direction, which would be transform.forward. and we want to multiply this to give it a fair amount of force. We're just giving it a burst of force right at the beginning. So I'm going to multiply this by 100. The other thing that we want to do before we actually cast our projectile, we want to turn the enemy so that it's facing towards the player. So I'm going to do transform dot look at. This takes the transform of this object and points it in a specific direction. And I want to look for game object dot find game object with tag. You'll notice there's two options here, find game objects and find game object. There's only one that we're looking for. So find game object with tag, and then in quotes, we'll put player dot transform dot position. So we're looking for the position of the player game object. And save this script. And now we actually have to go and tag the player. So I'm going to go back into my scene, find my player, and tag it from the dropdown as player. This is one of the default ones, so I don't actually have to create a new tag for this. Now I also want to give these enemies different cooldown times. Now normally if we're going to make changes to a prefab, we'd want to hit the arrow to make changes that will apply across. But in this case, I actually want to give each instance of the enemy a different cooldown time. So I'm going to select one of the enemies, and I'm going to give this one a cooldown time of 2. And I'm going to select a different one to give a cooldown time of 4. And the last one, I'm going to give a cooldown time of 5. And so now I can see that the enemies are targeting the player. So they're aiming at the player and firing their projectile. And I'm not actually resetting my projectile timer, so that's why it's spawning infinite instances of the projectile prefab. So let's go ahead and fix that. In our attack timer, once it reaches 0, what we actually want to do is reset that attack timer to our original cooldown. And save that, and then let's try again. So this is the one that has the shortest cooldown. And you can see they are each waiting for their own cooldown to happen and then firing the projectile. And so now I can target the enemies and the enemies can target me. Make sure you save your scene occasionally. Unity does have an occasional tendency to get stuck or crash, and you want to make sure that you frequently save your scene so you don't lose any progress. One thing that I want to add to this that I think will help improve how it looks and feels, I'm going to hit the arrow next to one of my enemies to edit the prefab, and I'm actually going to add a NavMesh agent component to the enemy. And this will allow the enemies to sort of shift slightly as the player is walking up to them. This will make it so that it sort of looks like the player pushes the enemies. This is a better way to do it than, say, having a rigid body, using that to push the enemies around, because that can cause the enemies to fall over or to fly away abruptly. But this allows them to shift around slightly. That way the player isn't actually walking into them. Next, what I want to do is have an actual character for my player. So I'm going to use Mixamo to download some characters with their animations. Mixamo is a great source for free characters and for free animations. If you don't already have an account, it's free to set one up, or you can just link your Adobe account if you already have one of those. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Characters tab, and you can select different characters to see how they look in this preview window. So you can go through until you find a character that you like. I think I'm going to use the sporty grandma for mine. So this is going to be my player character. So then we can go to the animations tab and we can look for an animation for her. You can either just click through animations until you find one that you like, or you can search for a specific type of animation. So I'm going to search for a walk animation. So we've got some different options here. It's kind of a gorilla walk. This one's a regular walk. It's sort of a sassy walk, I guess. I'm just going to stick with the regular walk for now. Now, one thing that we want to do is you can see that it's actually moving the character forward as she's walking. And this looks really nice in the preview, but once we get into Unity, this is actually going to cause her to not line up with the character object. So she's going to walk out of her object space. And so the navigations that we have set up to move the character isn't going to work with an animation that moves the character around. So what we want to do is check the box for in place. So now the walk animation is not moving her forward, and this way when we get into Unity, we are actually controlling what moves her forward. So I think this will be a good animation to use for her. You can also modify some of the parameters if you want to just see what those look like. And once you're happy with your animation, you can hit download. And the default format is FBX. And even though FBX is what we normally use in Unity, it's really important that we actually switch this to FBX for Unity. This works a lot better when you're importing it. So from the format dropdown, make sure you choose FBX for Unity. One problem with the FBX for Unity is it does not download the textures with it. So after we download the character and the animation, we will come back and download the textures separately. So I want to leave this set to with skin. So this downloads the mesh as well as the animation. Leave all the other settings the same and download. Once that has downloaded, we can find it in our folder, and then we just want to drag it into Unity. I'm going to make a new folder called characters, and this is where I'm going to import anything related to the characters for my player or for my enemy. So I'm going to download Sporty Grandma Walking, and I actually have a couple different versions because I downloaded it earlier as well. Sorry for the confusion there. So just import Sporty Grandma Walking. And you can see that if I drag her into the scene, you can see she does not have any textures with her. So I'm going to go back to Mixamo to download her textures. Once again, we'll hit the download tab, and this time I'm going to pick the Collada, the .dae extension. This will download with a zipped folder that has the textures with it. So I'm going to download that. And then I'm going to locate that zipped folder and extract it. And we're going to totally ignore the DAE file. All we want is the textures folder that it came with. So I'm going to take that textures folder and just drop it into my characters folder in Unity. Now I'm going to edit my player prefab. So I'm going to click the over arrow on the player, and I'm going to drag Sporty Grandma onto the player so it makes it a child object. And there she is in the scene, and I'm going to drag her down so that she completely fits inside of the capsule. Then I'm going to turn off the mesh render for the capsule. So this is the parent object. Uncheck the box for mesh render. So now the capsule is invisible and I can see the grandma. Now I'm going to apply her textures. So I'm going to select the mesh and drag the materials on, and you can see it has some space where it's not drawing her mouth or her forehead. It actually has a second texture for facial expressions, and that's this one here. So I'm going to drag that onto the face and onto the forehead. And then I'm going to find the materials that it generated. So it created a materials folder for the grandma. First, for the main material, I'm going to turn off the shininess. So let's turn down smoothness. And then for the face, I'm going to change this from opaque to cutout from the render mode dropdown. And then once again, I'm going to turn the smoothness down. Then this material, I'm also going to drag up to the top to use for her forehead. And so now I can see it is working correctly to draw her forehead and her mouth. So now if I back out from the player prefab, I can see there's the grandma in the scene. So the next thing I need to do is set up the animation that I imported. So I'm actually going to hop right back into that player prefab. It's important that once you have a prefab that you're always editing the prefab and not editing the object in the scene. So on my prefab for my character, I'm going to go inside of this sporty grandma object here in my folder, and I'm going to find the walking animation. And what I want to do is I want to drag this animation and just drop it on the animator, on the word animator for this component. And it will generate a new animator controller for us. It's really important that we have this animator controller. This controls what animation is being played by the character. If at any point your avatar slot is ever empty, you can always just go and find the avatar. It's the little thing that looks like a mannequin, and you just drag that onto the avatar slot. So now we've generated a controller for our animator. And if we click on the animator window, if you don't see your animator window, you can always find it from window, and it's under the animation tab, and it's called animator, animator with an R. And so from this window, we can see our walking animation. And right now, this is just going to play by default, but it's only going to play once. This animation is not set up to loop. So if we select the animation itself from the folder, the thing with the play button on it, and we can go to edit up here in the top. And while we're editing the animation, if we scroll down, we can check the box for loop time. This will cause the walk animation to loop, and then we can hit apply. It may find some issues, and it's okay to just hit fix now whenever it finds issues like that. And I'm going to go back out of my prefab now, and let's just go ahead and test it and see what's going on with it right now. So right now the walk animation is playing indefinitely, and so she keeps walking even as I'm moving around. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to make the speed of her walk animation based on the speed of the NavMesh agent moving around. That way when she's standing still, it won't actually be animating, it will be paused. This is actually a lot smoother of a transition than trying to stop the animation and start it, or transitioning between animations. So I'm going to go to my animator window once again. And if you don't see anything here, you just need to select the sporty grandma from the scene. It's okay if you're not in edit prefab mode right now. We're actually just modifying the animator controller. There's two tabs here, layers and parameters. And we're going to go to the parameters tab and hit the plus. And I'm going to add a float. And I'm going to call this float speed with a lowercase s. And the speed is going to control the speed of the animation. If you select the animation for walking, here where it has speed, it's set to 1, you can check this box for a parameter, and it uses the parameter from this dropdown. There's only one, which is the speed parameter we just made. It uses this as a multiplier, so it's going to use this to control how fast the animation is playing. So back in our script, we can apply that to the animator. I'm going to, on my, this is the enemies. On my player script, I'm going to make a public variable, public game object, not game object, a public animator. This is going to be the animator of the character. So I'm going to call this char anim, or character anim. And this is going to be a reference to the animator on my character. And I'm going to scroll down into my update function. And I'm going to specify the speed right here at the top of my update function. I'm going to do char anim dot set float, and then I'm going to pass it a string for the name of the float, which was speed with a lowercase s, and then I'm going to set the value, and the value that I want to use here is based on the NavMesh agent called my agent, and I'm going to get the velocity. That's the current speed and direction that the character is moving. And a velocity is a vector 3. So this is actually an x, y, and z value because it's specifying the direction. I don't care about the direction. I only care about how fast it is. So I'm going to do dot magnitude, which returns a single value, a single float for how fast that velocity is. So it's ignoring direction at this point. And end that with a semicolon. Then save your script, and back in your scene, we need to specify the animation that the player character is going to use, or the animator rather. So that's what this slot here is. And I don't just want to drag it in from the scene. Remember, since this is a prefab, we want to actually edit the prefab. So I'm going to go into prefab edit mode, drag that animator controller into the slot, and go back. And now we can test this out. So now when she's stationary, she's not playing the walk animation. And when she starts moving, it changes the speed of the animation based on how fast the NavMesh agent is moving. Now the NavMesh agent is based on a different speed scale than the way that the animation is being driven. So you can see that it's actually about double time of what we want. And so we can easily change this with the character selected again. I'm going to go back to the animator window, and we're going to select the walking animation. And instead of the speed of 1, we're going to change this to 0.5. So this will multiply whatever speed we're getting from this speed. This will multiply by 0.5. That way it will be closer of a match to the scale of the animation. And so now she is stationary when she's not walking, and you can see that she pauses in whatever pose she was at. So it starts and stops from exactly where it left off, which is a nice smooth transition rather than stopping and starting the animation, which could cause the animation to restart, which sometimes will look jittery. The next thing I want to do is add a character, object, and animation for my enemies. So I'm going to hop back into Mixamo and go back to the Characters tab. And let's remove that search for walk. And so now I'm looking for something to use as my enemy. So I'm going to find something for my sporty grandma to fight. I think I'm going to use this character. And I'm going to go back to the Animations tab. I don't need her to walk around. I just need her to attack. So from the search drop down, I'm going to check the box for combat. And here I can see some different options related to combat. Some of them have to do with using a gun. Some of them are punching or melee attacks. Here's a stabbing animation. So what I'm looking for is something that would work as a ranged attack. Ooh, here's a cool roundhouse kick. Let's keep going until we find something that would work for a ranged attack. This one looks pretty good. So she's casting a spell. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. And you'll notice that there was no checkbox for in place for this one, and that's fine. She's not really moving around a whole lot, and she goes back to the same start pose. So this is the one I want to use. You can also adjust these variables. So for example, this is a really slow animation, and I want her attack to happen really fast. So I'm going to bump overdrive up, which will increase the speed of the animation. And I'm going to download. And once again, I want to start by downloading FBX for Unity with skin. Download that. And then locate that file in your folder and import it into Unity. I'm just going to, once again, drag it into my characters folder. And just like we did before, we need to go back to download the textures. So I'll download the .dae extension, the Collada. And this will download a zipped folder that will contain the textures. So we can extract this and drag those textures into Unity. Now I'm going to edit my enemy prefab. So hit the over arrow on your enemy prefab. This is going to be the same process we did for the player. I'll drag the character onto the parent object and try to position her so that she is, as much as possible, entirely inside of the capsule. And I would definitely want to make sure that her feet align with the bottom of the capsule, because this is where the capsule aligns itself to the ground, and I want her feet to be touching the ground. Then select the parent object with the capsule and uncheck the box for mesh renderer. Then apply the texture for this character. And it makes it super shiny by default, so go to your materials for it, turn down the shininess. And her face has the texture already included, so I don't need to make any changes to that. While I'm in here, I'm going to go ahead and add her animation. So I'll go back into the characters, use the over arrow to find the animation, and it's the one with the play button, and then we just drag it onto the word animator, and it generates an animator controller for us. Now in the animator tab, this time I do not want her animation to be the default. I actually want her to not be animating as the default. So I'm going to create an empty state, and I'm going to right click on that empty state and set as layer default state. So now this will not have any animation applied to it. Then I'm going to right click and make transition, and I'm going to drag that to the two-handed spell casting animation. And I'm going to right click and make transition and bring that back also. So this will allow us to transition in and out of the attack. And I'm going to hit plus on the parameters again. And once again, make sure you're in the parameters tab in the animator. And this time we're going to use a trigger. And I'm going to call this trigger attack. This time I use a capital A, so just whatever you use, make sure you are consistent in your script. Then I'm going to select the arrow that goes to the animation. So the arrow shows you which way it's going. This arrow is going to the animation. So I'm going to hit the plus under conditions, and it will autofill with attack. And I want to uncheck the box for has exit time. I don't want it to automatically progress, which is what this does. The other arrow going back to the empty state, I'm going to leave the has exit time checked, and I'm going to give it the same attack condition to go back to the non-moving state. Now I'm going to back out of my enemy prefab, and I'm going to go into my enemy script. And inside of this enemy script, I'm going to trigger that animation to play, but I don't want it to actually happen at exactly the same time as I'm casting the projectile. I want the animation to start slightly before, because it actually has a little bit of a warm up into the animation. So I'm going to check if my attack timer is less than 0.25. So if my attack timer is less than 1/4 second, then I'm going to get component in children. The reason I'm looking for the component in children is because the thing that has the animator is actually a child of the main enemy object. So I'm going to get component in children animator dot set trigger, and once again we use the whatever we set for the trigger, which I used attack with a capital A, and end that with a semicolon, and we're not giving it any value, it's actually just setting a boolean for that attack trigger. And I'm going to save that, and then we can test it out in the scene. So now my characters are playing their animation as they cast their spell. You could also adjust the position of the character a little bit more based on where the spell is actually casting from, if it bothers you at all that the spell is slightly offset from her hands. So now I have my characters for both the enemies and for the player. Now, one thing you'll notice is now when I click on an enemy, I no longer have the red material to show me that that enemy is selected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a floating icon above the enemy's head so I know which enemy I have selected. So I'm going to use the over arrow to edit my enemy prefab, and I'm going to create a cube. This is going to go right above the player's or the enemy's head, and I'm going to rotate it and scale it so that it sort of looks like a floating icon above the head. And we're going to position it right over her head and then use rotate. And once you're happy with the position of that, then I'm going to go back to my materials and I'm going to use the same yellow material that we were using for the enemy before. And I can back out of that, and now I see all three of my enemies have their little floating icon above their head. Now what I want to do is in my enemy script, I'm going to make a public game object for this floating icon. I'm going to call this selector. And save that change to the script. And again, this is something that we want to apply to all of the enemies, so I am going to, once again, hit the arrow to go back into prefab edit mode. And then on my script, I can see now I have an empty selector slot, and I want to drag the cube into that slot. And if I back out, then I can check and see that each of my other enemies has had this change applied, so they each are referencing their own cube above their head. Now in my player script, I can make a slight change to where I'm changing the target material color, both places where I'm changing it to red and also where I'm changing it back to yellow. So the change that I want to make is before the get component mesh renderer. So I'm just going to insert some code in here. So I have my collider, my hit collider, and I'm going to get component enemy. So I'm actually going to reference the enemy script and open and close parenthesis there. Dot and selector, which is the public game object. Dot, and now I'm leaving the rest. Get component mesh renderer dot material dot color equals color dot red. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy this get component enemy dot selector dot. I'm going to paste this into my enemy target dot get component enemy dot selector dot get component mesh renderer. So this will set it back to yellow. And now we can test that out. So now I can select whichever enemy I want to attack. And if you want the icon above the head to move actually and stay with the head, you'll notice it looks like it's slightly floating away from the head when the character animates. And if you'd like it to actually move with the head, we can hop back into that prefab. And I'm going to toggle open my character, and I can go down through the joints. So I'm going to go through the spine and find the neck and the head. So here's the head joint. So this will actually move with the head when it's animating. And I'm going to drag the cube so that it's a child of the head joint. And now let's back out. And that should hopefully have applied to all of my enemies. So now we can see now when she moves, her icon actually moves with her. It does look like it's moving a little bit more than I want it to. It's sort of shaking because she's tilting her head forward. So a better option might be, instead of putting it on the head, I might actually put it on the neck or the top joint of the spine. These two will both probably move a little bit less than the head. So I'm going to try putting it on the neck joint, and we'll see how that looks. So that's looking a little bit better than it did on the head. Still a little bit jittery, but you can mess around with that until you find a joint that feels more natural. You can also just leave it on the entire parent object if you don't want it to move around with the character at all. That's kind of a personal preference. Okay, so now let's add some health and damage, both for our character and for our enemies. I'm going to start by doing the character, my player. I'm going to, in my script, I'm going to add a private int health equals 100. So I'll start my player at 100 health. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a slider on the screen so I can see the health when it goes up and down. So I'm going to go into game object, UI, and slider. And a slider is a great way to quickly and easily make a health bar. So I'm going to position my slider on the canvas. If you're not familiar with the canvas, it's very large compared to the rest of your scene. It's rendered by a separate camera, so you have to scroll way out to edit the canvas items. And you want to make sure that wherever you're positioning your UI elements, that you're binding them to those correct edges. So since I want my health bar down here at the bottom of the screen, what I want to do is bind it to the bottom. So we do that with this little thing that looks like a crosshair. This shows you where it's being bound. Currently it's being bound to the center where this cross is. And if you select this one here, you can see the cross move to the bottom. So now it's bound to the bottom of the screen. Now I'm going to make a few changes to the slider to make it more functional as a health bar. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the handle. So if you toggle down into it, you can turn off the handle object. So now it's not showing me the handle. And I'm also going to, on the top slider object, if we scroll down, we have some values we can change. I'm going to set the max value to 100. And you can drag this value here and you can see the bar fill up and go down as you're dragging this value. I'm also going to change this to whole numbers. Generally, when we're working with health, we probably want our health to be in whole numbers from 0 to 100. And one thing you'll notice is when I'm all the way at full health, all the way at 100, there's a little bit of space here. This is what used to be covered by the handle. So to fix that, we can go to the fill area, and we can see the left side is set to 5, but the right side is set to 15. This is sort of the padding from the edge. And so we can set this to 5 to match the left-hand side, and now that bar fills all the way up. Another thing that's nice to do with health is to have your fill color and your background color be distinct. I like to do green for my fill color. Green is for full health. And then my background color, I'll make sort of a dark reddish color. And then if we slide through on the slider, we can see that as our health depletes, we go from having a green bar to having a red bar. You can also make some adjustments to make this larger if you'd like to. You can adjust the width and the height. I'm going to make the height 40, so it's a little bit more clear and easy to see. And now what we need to do is give the player script a reference to that slider. So I'm going to make a public slider. And once again, it's not auto-filling this for me because this is using a feature that I need to add in my using section. So I'm going to add using Unity Engine.UI. This will allow us to access UI elements. So now my slider turned green, and I'm going to name this health bar. So now I want to update my health value and the health bar at the same time. I'm going to update them when I take damage. So what I want to do is down below my update function, make sure you go outside of your update function, but inside of the last curly bracket. So don't go past the last curly bracket. So outside of my update function, I'm going to make a new function called on trigger enter. And I'm going to check if the thing I collided with, other.tag, is tagged as damage. So if it's tagged as damage, then I'm going to take damage. I'm going to reduce my health. So here, if it's tagged as damage, I'm going to do health minus equals 10. So I'll take my health down by 10. And I'm going to update my health bar, my slider. So health bar dot value equals health. I also want to check if my health has gone below 0. I'm going to check less than or equal to 0. The reason we check less than or equal to is because depending on if you have multiple things causing damage, you might actually never hit exactly 0. So you want to check also if it's below 0. And then what we want to do is reload the scene. Once again, I need to add another tool to be able to use scene management. So using Unity engine dot scene management. This will allow us to load different scenes. We actually just want to load the same scene, but it's still using the scene manager. Dot load scene, and we'll load scene 0. Save our changes. Back into our scene. In order to load scenes, we actually have to have them set up in our build settings. So you want to go to your build settings and hit add open scenes. This adds whatever scenes you already have open. If there's any other scenes in here already, you can just delete those. You should only have the main scene that you're working in right now, and it should be scene 0. And we'll go ahead and save our scene while we're at it. And let's test this out. I should hold still and let them hit me. We have a null reference. So one of the things that we forgot to do was actually to give the player a reference to the slider. So let's go ahead and drag the slider into the health bar slot. Now you'll notice I'm doing this not in the edit prefab mode, because when you're editing a prefab, you can only drop in objects that are inside of that prefab. So I can see I have the empty slot here, but there's nothing in the prefab that I can drag in. So in order to use something that's in the scene but not in the prefab, we have to do it outside of edit prefab mode. So now our health bar should be linked. And now I am taking damage. One thing to note here is I did already tag my prefabs as damage. I did that right when I created the prefabs. But if yours is not working, just double check and make sure that your projectile is tagged as damage. So now I have my health depleting, and I have restarting the scene when my health reaches 0. Another thing that I want to do is when I am hit by a damage prefab, I want to also destroy that thing. So I'm going to destroy other.gameObject. So this destroys the projectile when it hits me. Now, even having the projectile disappear once it hits me, it's not very satisfying. So one of the things that is really nice to do is to add some particle effects at a time like this. So I'm going to create an empty game object in my scene so I can work with some particles. So let's create an empty game object, add component particle system. I'm going to go into my scene so I can see what I'm doing. And by default, you get these purple squares, which are super ugly. So we want to go down to the renderer and hit the circle next to material. And you can import other textures if you want for sprites for your particle effects, or you can make your own. But I'm just going to use the default particle for now. So select default particle as your material. And I'm going to make a few changes here. So first of all, all of them are going in one direction. I kind of want them to just go out from the center. So I'm going to change the shape from cone to sphere. It's under this shape drop down. And I'm going to make the radius smaller. I don't want a whole lot of space that they're coming out of. So I'm going to change the radius to 0.1 and the radius thickness to 0.1 also. It can be helpful to see this in context close to the things that you're working with. So just to quickly move it into the center of my scene, I'm going to make it a child of one of my cubes in my scene and zero out the position. And then double click so that I can bring it into focus. And I'm going to take it back out of the child. That was just to get it into the correct space. So now I can see it better in context. And so I can see that the particles are way too large. And they're also going way too far and for way too long. So I'm going to reduce my duration to 0.5 and also the start lifetime to 0.5. And I'm going to reduce the speed. Let's try 3 for the speed. And the start size, I'm also going to change to 0.2. Then under emission, we have rate over time, which is how fast the particles are coming out. I'm going to change this to 0. And instead of using rate over time, we're going to use a burst. So I'm going to hit the plus button here to add a burst. Then I'm going to add color over lifetime. And what I really like to do with particles is to have the alpha value start at 0 and fade in. And so I'm going to select the top anchors here are the alpha values and the bottom ones are the color. So I'm going to select the top one and set the start value to 0 alpha. And I'm also going to start the end value to 0 alpha. So now the particles fade in and out. You can also change the color. So I'm going to have the start color be red, and then I'm going to have it fade to, let's say, orange. Also, this is a lot of particles, and it's not really necessary to have this many. The more particles you have going on at the same time, the lower your frame rate will be. So I'm just going to lower in my burst section. Count here is how many particles are being generated, and I'm going to change this to 18. The last thing I want to do is uncheck the box for loop so that it will only run once. Once you uncheck the box for looping, you can't really see what you're doing, so you can hit play to see it simulate. We might also want, this is basically going to be like a blood splatter when it hits the player. So sometimes it's nice for something like this to have gravity applied to it. So we have a gravity modifier here, and I'm going to set this to 0.5. You can maybe even set it all the way up to 1. Let's try that. That looks all right. So now I'm going to change the name of this to Blood Splat. And I'm going to drag it into my resources folder to create a prefab for that. And I'm going to delete it out of my scene. And now in my script, where I'm taking my damage after I destroy the projectile, I'm going to instantiate resources.load blood splat. And I need to give it a position. I'm just going to use the position. You know what? Let's move this line actually. Let's do this before we destroy the other object, because I'm actually going to use the other object's position. If we used the transform of this object that the script is attached to, that's actually the grandma, so it would be coming out of the center of her. I think it makes more sense to come out of wherever the projectile collided with her. So now we can use other dot transform dot position and other dot transform dot rotation. End that with a semicolon and save your script. Now let's see it in action. So now I have my particle effect playing whenever a projectile hits the grandma. I'm going to actually move my camera in a little bit closer into the scene so I can see what's happening a little bit better. I think I also want those projectiles to move a bit faster. So in my enemy script, where I am instantiating the projectile, I'm going to increase the amount of force that I'm adding. I'm going to change this to 300 to get those projectiles going a little bit faster. So now this is looking pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is add the health bars above the enemies so I can see how much health the enemies have. And then that will also tie into adding an attack for the grandma to attack the enemies. Let's add a health bar for our enemies. I actually want to use a separate canvas for the enemies because rather than the player health, I'm actually going to have this be in the world space, so it'll be attached to the enemies. So I'm going to go into my edit prefab mode once again, and I'm going to create game object UI slider. And so this created a separate canvas inside of my prefab. So inside of my enemy prefab, I now have an entire canvas object. And I'm going to change it from screen space overlay on the canvas itself. So select the canvas, change screen space overlay to world space. This will allow you to move it and position it in the actual world. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it way down. And I'm going to set the X, Y, and Z position to 0 so I can find it close to my character. Keep scaling it down until you get into a reasonable size. And the actual position of the canvas doesn't matter. You can position the slider independently. So I'm going to go ahead and position the slider above my character's head. And slightly in front of the character also. And I can see my sliders actually going backwards. So I'm going to rotate my canvas around so it faces the other way. And if you hold control while you're rotating, it lets you snap. Oops. And now my slider's actually behind the character. So let's move that in front of the character. And fill the slider bar all the way up. Just like we did before, we're going to set it to whole numbers, set the maximum to 100. And then we're going to turn off the handle. Just uncheck the box. Then the fill area, change the right side to 5 so it fills all the way up. And then underneath the fill area, the fill object, we're going to change that color. And then we'll change the background color to red. Then on the enemy script, we're just like we did before, we need to add using Unity engine.ui. Make a public slider called health bar and a private int health equals 100. For my character attack, I'm actually going to have my player do a melee attack. but it's still going to use a collider, and the collider is going to trigger the enemy at some point. So I'm going to add my void on trigger enter, and I'm going to check if my other dot tag, and I already know I'm going to tag the collider that is on the grandma. I'm going to tag it as melee, so I'll just type that in here now. So if my enemy collides with the tag melee, then I want to do damage. So once again, health minus equals. I'm going to have each hit from the grandma do 25 damage instead of 10 like the projectiles do. Then I'm going to do health bar dot value equals health. And this time, if my health is less than or equal to 0, instead of reloading the scene, because this is on the enemy, so instead of reloading the scene, I actually want to destroy the enemy. Destroy game object. So we'll destroy this enemy object that it's attached to. Let's go back to that prefab, and I'm going to select my enemy, find the enemy script, and I'm going to drag the slider into the health bar slot. Then if I back out, I can see now all of my enemies have a health bar attached to them. And I'm going to go ahead and add an attack animation for the grandma. So let's go back to Mixamo for a second. Let's go back to our grandma character. So I'm not going to use the cast animation for her because she's going to do actually a melee attack. So we're going to go back to search for combat. So let's find something for the grandma to do. Could have her do a punch. Could have her do a roundhouse kick. One thing to notice here is that you can see she moves forward and the animation doesn't actually go back to her start position, and there's no in place option. So this one would actually, when she's playing it, she'll actually end up in the wrong position and she'll end up snapping back to where she started. So I'm not going to use this one for that reason. I'm actually just going to go back to the punching animation. And I'm going to download this. Make sure you switch it to FBX for Unity. And find this in the folder. Drag it, oops. Drag it into Unity. Oops, and I did not mean to put it in my resources folder, so I'm just going to move it to my characters folder. Then with the Sporty Grandma selected, if I go to the animator, now I'm back into her animator controller, and I can add in this new animation that I brought in, this punching animation. If you toggle open the new grandma that you brought in, you should be able to find this with the play button, the punching animation. We're going to make a transition from walking to punching, and we're going to go ahead and make that transition back also. Then I'm going to add another parameter. Once again, make sure you're on the parameters tab. This is going to be a trigger. I'm going to call this trigger punch. And we want to trigger this from the walking animation to the punching animation. When I hit the plus, it automatically fills in speed, so I'm going to change this to punch. I'm going to uncheck has exit time, and I'm going to drag these little handles here. I want this animation to start pretty much right away. And I don't want very much of a transition into it. I want this to be really snappy. And then the animation or the transition to go back to the walking animation, I'm going to leave the has exit time checked. Actually, I think I'm going to also move these this transition back to walking so that it will complete the punch animation before it goes back to walking. And for this one, going to the punching, I'm actually going to make this even smaller of a transition. Just trying to get it right at the very start. I don't want very much of a transition between these. Okay, so now I have the grandma set up with her punch animation. Now I need to actually trigger her animation, the player script. So this is going to be where I have my enemy target in my update function. So I'm going to go outside of all of this if, because I want this to be a continuous check. So I'm going to check if my enemy target is not null, which means I have a target. And if I have a target, and I also want to check if my distance is close enough to the target. So I'm going to check vector3 dot distance. And I'm going to check between my transform dot position and my enemy target dot transform dot position. If this distance is less than, let's say, 0.5. So if I'm within 0.5 of the enemy, then I want to trigger that animation change. So I will do char anim dot set trigger. And did I actually set a trigger? What did I call my trigger? Punch. Ah, my trigger is called punch. Okay, so I'm going to set my trigger as punch with a capital P. And let's save that. One other thing that I want to check is to make sure that it's not continuously triggering this punch animation as I'm standing next to the enemy. I'm going to add one more condition in here. So I'm going to add another pair of ampersands. And this other condition that I want to check is I'm going to check the char anim dot get current animator state info. And it needs a layer because you can have different layers in your animator. And right now everything I have is in layer 0. And I'm going to check if the name of the state, so is name, and in parentheses we put a string. So the name that I want to check for is I want to check if it's the walking state. So I want to make sure that it's playing the walking animation. And I'm just going to double check to make sure walking is the name of this state, and it is. So it's going to check if this state is walking. If so, it's going to transition to the punching state, and it won't continuously trigger while we're in the punching state. Make sure you have your ampersands in the right place. And we'll go ahead and save this and test it out. So now she'll switch to her punching animation. And it looks like, come on, punch. It might be my imagination, but it looks like her punch is, yeah, so she's continuing to trigger her punch even after I've finished that animation. So I'm going to try just adjusting this even a little bit more. This is on the transition from walking to punching. So I'm going to make that as close to 0 as possible so that it doesn't trigger multiple times. And we'll see if that fixes it. Okay, so now it's not triggering a second time after she walks away. Okay, so now that we have her punching when she gets close enough to her enemies, let's add a trigger, a melee trigger, to the grandma so that she can actually do some damage. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a trigger on her hands. So I'm going to go down inside of the character and inside of the joints under hips, spine, and I'm looking for her right shoulder. And I'm going to go to her right hand. And so this is where I'm going to put a trigger since she's swinging with her right hand to punch. I'm going to add a box collider. Let's make this a lot smaller. Let's try 0.2 for everything. And I'm going to adjust the X value so that it's more towards the end of her hand. And then we're going to make sure we check the box for is trigger. We also want to tag this as melee. That was the tag that I checked for. Melee, make sure you spell it the same way. And then go back to the hand and tag this hand as melee. So this is now going to be the thing that does damage to the enemies. One other thing I need to add to the enemies, in order for onTriggerEnter to work, one of the objects needs to be a rigid body. So I'm going to make my enemy a rigid body. I'm going to uncheck use gravity. I'm also going to check the box for is kinematic so that the rigid body is not allowing it to be pushed around. So when the enemy walks into it, it won't knock the character over. And back out from that. And let's see if our enemy damage script is working. All right, so it looks like our enemy damage script is working. One thing I'm seeing that is not so great is that the grandma is actually, sometimes she won't punch in quite the right direction at the enemy. So I'm going to make a couple of slight tweaks where she's doing her punch animation. First thing I'm going to do is set my agent destination to her current position, transform.position. That way it stops trying to slide her forward while she's punching. The other thing I want to do is have her look at the enemy, so transform.look at enemy target dot transform dot position. That way she'll actually be facing the enemy when she punches. Another thing that I want to improve is you might notice that the health bars on the enemies actually, since they're in world space, they actually rotate around with the enemies, and sometimes they're facing entirely the wrong way. So what I want to do is have a script specifically for those health bars to make them face the screen. So I'm going to go into my scripts folder, create a new C# script. I'm going to call this billboard UI. Billboarding is the technique used to cause an object to always face the camera. So I'm going to make this new billboard UI script. I'm going to go into my enemy prefab and select the slider for my enemy and drag this billboard UI onto that component area. Now I can back out from my prefab, open up the script. And what I'm going to do with this script is I'm going to have the rotation of the UI element be the same rotation as the camera. So I'm going to do transform.rotation equals camera.main. This finds whatever main camera you have in this scene. transform dot rotation. So this finds the rotation of the camera and sets the same rotation for the UI elements. So they're facing the same direction that the camera is facing. And let's try that out. And so now my UI elements are always facing the camera. And so no matter where the character is turning, it's always updating those UI elements. All right, so this is looking a lot better. One other thing that I think just might be fun to add is basically the way I have the player character set up is there wouldn't be anything wrong with having multiple playable characters, a single player controlling them, so sort of like you have multiple units that you're sending into battle. So the only thing holding us back from that right now is the fact that we have a single UI bar on the screen. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to put the UI element inside the grandma prefab like we have for the enemies. And I'm going to save time, I'm actually going to open up one of the enemies and copy that canvas. I'm going to Control C to copy. Then I'm going to go into Edit my grandma. And Control V so it pastes in this canvas. Set the canvas position to 0 to bring the UI element close to the grandma, then position this slider however we need it to be. And this slider already has the Billboard UI script on it since I copied this from the enemies. Then on the player object up top, now I'm going to drag this slider into the health bar. So it's going to use this one instead of the main scene. And I'm going to go back out of editing my character. And with the character selected, you can see that this health bar is bolded, and it's actually still using the main one in the scene. I no longer need this one, so I can go ahead and delete that. But that doesn't update the health bar on the character object. To get this to use whatever was the actual prefab version, if we scroll up to the top, there's a section called Overrides, and we can do Revert All. So this forces this object to use the defaults for this prefab. So now we can see that it's using the correct slider. And now I can duplicate my grandma. And I'm also going to move this enemy because she's actually a little bit off screen. So now I have multiple grandmas, and they will all attempt to walk towards where I am clicking, and you'll notice that the enemies are not properly targeting the player anymore. And the reason for that is because we actually lost our tag. So I had tagged the object and not the prefab. So when we reverted the prefab, it lost this tag. So I'm going to just go into the prefab and reset this tag to player. And so now they should all be tagged as player. Now, all of the enemies, when they search for a player in the scene, they're all going to find the same player. It has a hierarchy search to search for the tag. So it's not going to target at random, but I actually don't want it to target at random. I think it would make the most sense for all three of these enemies to target the same grandma until she is dead, and then to move on to target the next one. So now all these grandmas will gang up to attack this enemy. And the one other thing that I want to change is if one of the grandmas dies, it's actually going to restart the whole scene. So if you lose a single grandma, it restarts. And if you wanted to change that in your player script, instead of reloading the scene, you could just destroy this object. This way, it's not destroying all of the characters. or this way it's not reloading the scene instead of destroying the characters. So now we have a somewhat completed combat system. We have the ability to control multiple units and to set them to target an enemy. And the enemies have health and damage. The playable characters also have health and damage. It might be a little bit confusing having all of the health bars using red and green. So I'm going to change the Grandma health bar. Instead of having it be green, I'm actually going to make hers blue to match her jumpsuit. And I'm going to make the background color orange just so that it's distinguishable from the enemies. And as always, make sure you save your scene to save your progress. And the Grandma's Triumph. And so that's it for this combat demo in Unity. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and come back and check us out for the next one.